So I decided today would be a good day to talk about bastards. Not the illegitimate sons of aristocrats, but rather the sharp metal bar that wants to slice through your neck. Well, it doesn't really want anything, it's just an inanimate object.
It is only inanimate because it does not possess the soul of a samurai!
Anyway, so terminology. What do you call this thing? Well, a sword, obviously. And that's exactly what they called it back in the day. In medieval times, they didn't have a whole lot of specialized terms for different categories of swords. They would just call them sword. If it's a longer sword, they would call it a long sword. Like this here, for instance. This would be a long sword. But this would also be a long sword, even though it's not quite as long. And this could also be called a bastard sword or a hand-and-a-half sword. So what's this? Well, not a long sword. Contrary to what video games and fantasy literature often tries to tell you, this is specifically not a long sword. In fact, they called long swords to distinguish them from arming swords, or simply one-handed swords, because they are longer than a one-handed sword. There is a certain limit to the length when it comes to one-handed swords, because at a certain point it just becomes impractical to wield. It just becomes too long. Depending on the martial arts system, there is the rule of thumb that when you hold the sword at your side, the tip should not touch the ground for a one-handed sword. But that does not mean that if it's a little longer, it's not still an arming sword. It can still be. And arming sword is simply the term for a medieval one-handed sword. From the historical sword fighting manuals, they would just call this a sword, and they would call this a longsword. All the other terms are of modern origin. It would be knightly sword, arming sword, riding sword. That's all more modern terms, 20th century. So what makes this sword a long sword is, well, its length, obviously, but also the fact that you can use it with two hands. And in fact, it's mainly designed for two-handed use in mind. It is not what some people call a true two-handed sword, or a Zweihander, or two-hander. This kind of thing here. Very long for two-handed use only, and it is used in a somewhat different way because you're dealing with a lot more length and mass, and you have to focus more on maintaining momentum as you swing. So a longsword is handled differently, and of course it is quite a difference both in size and in shape. But to distinguish between the two, you can call this a greatsword and this a longsword. So what's a bastard sword, or a hand-and-a-half sword as it's also sometimes called? Well, a longsword. It's a longsword as well, but it's a particular type of longsword, you can say. It's usually a little shorter. And right now I'm going more on what I think it should be called for clarity's sake. I don't claim to be a historian or an expert on terminology by any means, but this just makes sense to me and would be helpful if it was standard terminology. A bastard sword is kind of something in between an arming sword and a longsword, while still being a longsword technically. So as you can see, it's not quite as long as this type of longsword, but it's clearly longer than the arming sword, although the blades are actually relatively similar. But in any case, this one here is a really good example because it's very clear with its handle shape and length. So normally on a longsword, you have space in between the two hands. So the main hand is up here, or maybe a little further down, depending on the tradition that you go on, and the other hand is either here or at the pommel. So there's at least one hand in between the two hands, roughly speaking. So the reason why you want that extra space is simply for leverage. This just gives you a lot more leverage than this does. This is not very effective. And in fact, a lot of the historical techniques can't really be done this way. So here's an example of one of the techniques that require a bit of space between the hands, or at least otherwise they're very awkward. The Krumpau, or crooked strike. There is some debate as to how you execute it exactly, and the different schools favor different traditions, but the way I like to do it, at least so far, until my instructors tell me otherwise, is like this. So thumb on the flat, or on the guard and striking like this. So this is extremely awkward to do like that, because my wrists meet earlier when I do that, as opposed to here where there's more space for my wrist, so I can rotate more easily. And I can generate a lot more power this way as opposed to that. Another example is the shield how or squinting strike, where you cut with the false edge of the sword. On a double-edged blade, the edge that's facing the opponent is called the true edge. The edge that's facing the user is called the false edge. It's just to distinguish between the two. So you strike, normally you strike down directly with the false edge, which I'm reluctant to do because of the ceiling. So instead I'm going to do it like this, but it's the same idea. You cut down with the false edge like this. And this is extremely weird to do if the hands are all together. I mean, you can do it, but it's very awkward and feels really weak compared to doing it this way. And that also explains the peculiar shape of this handle here. You'll see the handle up here is regular size, and the main hand fits very well on this. Then it tapers down to a really thin and narrow part, and this feels rather strange. So then you have the pear-shaped pommel here, which you can grasp quite nicely. So this actually encourages you to not place your hand here where it's all strange, but down there. Grasp the pommel to get the additional leverage and do what you have to do to execute the techniques. The other reason that makes this a true bastard sword is you can use it effectively in one hand. Granted, you can also use other longer and heavier longswords in one hand, but it's a lot more awkward. This is both light and short enough and has the right kind of balance to facilitate one-handed use. It's, again, not quite as effective in one hand as an actual arming sword. Of course, the sword that is actually designed for one as opposed to two-handed use will of course be more nimble and easier to use, but this is simple enough. You can definitely easily use this in one hand without having to worry about it being very unwieldy. So why would you want to use the sword with one hand anyway when you can use it with two? Because two hands, of course, are advantageous. You get more control, more power, you get more different options for different strikes that you couldn't do as well with one hand. So why would you want to do that? Well, first of all, you could use a shield with it if you wanted to, or a buckler. And even a pretty small buckler like this, although it might seem puny, can be quite an advantage. For example, you can protect your hand as you strike. Depending on where your opponent's sword is, you will always get extra protection there. You can strike with it, you can parry while striking with the sword. And even if you don't have anything in your offhand, it's good to have it available for grappling. That way you could, for example, parry and wrap your arm around your opponent's arm and strike. And of course, if you're on a horse, it's an advantage to be able to hold onto the reins with one hand while using the sword in the other. So there you have it. That's my attempt at explaining what a bastard sword is. And for those who are wondering about this particular one here, this is a reproduction made by Arms and Armor. It's their English longsword. So yeah, they call it a longsword as opposed to a bastard sword, which is not wrong. A bastard sword is also a longsword. But what sometimes annoys me, admittedly, is when even high-profile manufacturers call a full-size longsword a bastard sword, even though it has a very long handle that is clearly meant for two-handed use only. It's a little strange, but oh well, I guess it's just nerdy nitpicking, if you will. So for those who are interested in this reproduction here, I'll post a link down below in the video description, and I'll also test it and review it, of course, but that might take a while. So I hope you found this interesting, and thanks for watching.